This is the Everything 80s Podcast, Episode 2, The Story and History of the Transformers.
Transformers, more than meets the eye. Autobots raise their battle to destroy the evil forces of the Decepticons. The Transformers, robots in disguise. The Transformers.
Hey guys, what's happening? Welcome to the Everything 80s Podcast, brought to you by everything80spodcast.com. I'm Jamie, and today, obviously no surprise here, looking at the history and the story of the Transformers, which goes back quite a way. Very detailed, a lot of stolen ideas, if you want to say, leading to cartoons, movies, you know the whole deal. But this is going to give you like the real Transformers 101 insight. So before we start, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. That way you'll get them automatically sent to you each time. I don't have to hand deliver them. It's easy for everybody. Okay, let's get right to it. So there's obviously a lot of toys and cartoons that burst on the scene in the 1980s, and they've been instrumental in most kids' childhoods. And to Transformers maybe stand above the rest. We'll see. For a quick summary, Transformers were a toy line and cartoon series from 1904 produced by Hasbro and became one of the best-selling toys of all time. It led to the animated movie in 1986, which we'll get to, many future toy lines, a bunch of live-action movies that we'll unfortunately try to cover. But to me, this is it. This is the definitive toy and cartoon series to me growing up in the 80s. I'd say G.I. Joe was a very close second, but something just captured the imagination in a different way with Transformers. I don't know. I don't remember any other toy leaving me as kind of in awe and just like spellbound by them. I remember one year looking under the Christmas tree and positive I saw the distinctive box shape of what I hoped was Soundwave. I'd seen it in the store, the packaging, I knew the shape, the size, like everything, and the present wrapped on the tree looked exactly like it. So the anticipation and excitement was like next level for me until Christmas Day when I opened it and realized it was one of those big multi-packs of Lifesavers. I don't know if you remember those. They came in like a book form. You could open them up. Crushing. So, Transformers shaped a whole generation and would actually cause some significant heartache, which we'll get to as well. And I'm not just talking the Michael Bay movies. So, okay, let's look back at the origins of the Transformers. So, like I had mentioned, the idea of Transformers as you know it may not have been an original idea. And the origins start with a toy line called Diaclone. They were made by a company called Takara Toys and launched in 1980 in Japan. It was a line of toys that included some transforming vehicles and robots that were piloted by miniature figures, and they came from a line called Micromen. So in 1982, they put out a line of car robots that were also able to transform. This whole transforming thing was just somewhat of like a hot thing in the toy market in Japan going into the 80s. So Hasbro, who you would know is putting them out in North America, either too lazy to come up with something or just seeing the huge potential, license the car robot toy line along with some of those Microman toys from Takara. And these would be combined to create the Transformers. So many of the Autobot versions of the Transformers came straight from this old car robot line from Diaclone, and a lot of future Transformers would already exist in the Takara toy line, including things like Dinobots, the Insecticons, all the Decepticon planes. If you remember the Constructicons, they were all there. They've already been established. It was Hasbro sent these executives like all around the world to various toy fairs, and the Tokyo Toy Fair is always like one of the main ones because they're so advanced in their toy making and their ingenuity and their ideas. So they went to the Tokyo Toy Show in 1983. And this is when they're on the lookout for some of these new toys to bring to North America. So right there, they bought everything. They bought the whole kit and caboodle. They bought the rights and all the molds to all 28 figures that were in the Diaclone line. And if you want to actually see, you can look these up online, but if you want to go to the show notes today, and that's where I put everything on the website. It's got the full blog and information. It's got a lot of the pictures of the earlier Diaclone toys. You can see everything. So that's everything80spodcast.com/2. So everything and then 80spodcast.com/2. That's all there. Just if you want to check out, what some of these things were. I mean, they're just blatantly ripped off. They didn't change a lot. So the thing though with Hasbro is they had really great foresight to know it wasn't always an ideal move to just release a new toy line out of the blue. This is, maybe one of the issues with foreign toy markets. They don't really have the insight into creating a story. They just release the toys. This is Hasbro's thing. Like, they're not just selling toys, they're telling stories. Giving toys a backstory and character profiles, it creates more of an identity that kids can connect with. If you just have some robots that transform, it's cool, but it's a lot more interesting when you realize they are a robotic race from a planet called Cybertron, and they're comprised of good and evil robots. It makes this universe, which is obviously still being capitalized and marketed and promoted today with the Marvel universe, the DC universe. Everything's got a universe now because you've got to build out the backstory for people to connect with it more. So, and this is interesting, Hasbro actually turned to Marvel to develop the backstory with, names, a short description of each character, all this stuff. And the story would be developed by the editor-in-chief from Marvel at the time called Jim Shooter and a guy named Dennis O'Neil, while a guy named Bob Budiansky, I hope that's right, Bob, if you're listening, he would be the guy to create the Transformers names and the characteristics. So Budiansky was actually a comic book writer. He was an editor. He was a penciler. He'd worked for Marvel for a good 20 years. So he knew how to create. And besides coming up with names and backstories, he would write some interesting, I don't know if you remember this, the tech specs. And these were the biographies that would end up being printed on the packaging that would sell the Transformer toys. You remember if you had them and you'd look over, they each had this like profile and these tech specs just saying like what made it up, what's their strengths or weaknesses, all that sort of stuff. So I just remember these very well because they're obviously very technical toys that were a real challenge to put together. It's like a robotic Rubik's Cube. But it was cool to learn about each robot's specific technical details. It was just something, it gave each character a bit more of a personality quirk that you could, potentially identify with. So looking at the backstory, I mean, there's no way that you don't know this. If you're listening to this podcast, you're probably a huge fan of Transformers. In case you need a refresh, here it is. The Transformers are made up by the heroic Autobots led by Optimus Prime and the evil Decepticons led by the villainous Megatron. They lived on a metallic planet called Cybertron, and both groups would have to leave Cybertron to try and find new sources of energy to be able to revitalize their war efforts. This would lead them to crash land on Earth, where they lay dormant for 4 million years. When they awakened in the year 1984, the Decepticons began to pillage the Earth, while the Autobots attempted to protect the new world they find themselves in. Now, this wouldn't be fully revealed until the cartoon series would launch in 1984, but the general story of the Autobots versus Decepticons was there. So the cartoon series, we'll get to this in a bit, this is going to be one of the earliest and most successful examples of a show being made primarily to launch a toy. There'd be a lot that would follow it, but they were really one of the early innovators. Hasbro in general, and they would do this with G.I. Joe. But, there would be a lot of Transformers toys that would come out over the years and decades, but we're going to look mainly at the ones that came out in the mid-'80s and the ones that would tie into the cartoon, the original cartoon movie, all that stuff, which is probably what you're interested in learning about anyway. So that first release of Transformers included a lot of toys, 28 of them. So it was made up of 18 Autobots and 10 Decepticons. Out of these 28 toys, 11 of the Autobots would transform into cars, 6 into mini cards, and 1 into a semi-tractor trailer. You obviously know who that is. For the Decepticons, 3 would turn into planes, 1 would be a cassette recorder, RIP Soundwave, 5 would be mini cassettes. If you're listening to this and you're under, 25, you're going to have to ask your parent what a cassette was. But those were the ones used for Soundwave. And then 1 would turn into a gun, Megatron. So Good luck getting that made today. But at the time, that was the go-to choice. So here are the characters that made up that first release. So with the Autobots, Optimus Prime and Roller. Remember, that was that little thing that came in the back of the trailer. You had Blue Streak, Hound, Ironside, Jazz, Prowl, Ratchet, Sideswipe, Sunstreaker, Tailbreaker, and Wheeljack. And with the Decepticons, you had Megatron, Soundwave, and then Buzzsaw, Laserbeak, Ravage, Frenzy, and Rumble, who were those cassettes that were inside them. Then you had Skywarp, Starscream, and Thundercracker. So, it seems like a big toy line right away, but it's because they were all taken from that original Diaclone series. And most of them were just clones of each other. If you can remember this, like they would change the paint and the accessories, but the physical actions to transform them were basically exactly the same. So really, they only released like 10 toys. So examples like Ironside and Ratchet were exactly the same. Prowl, Blue Streak, and Smokescreen were the exact same. And then like Starscream, Thundercracker, and Skywarp were just all the same plane with just like them different markings on them. So that brings us into Series 2 of the Transformers, of the toys, first off. So the second series of the Transformers reissued all the toys from the first set plus 26 new toys. This is a big thing along the years. They would re-release the first lines. So this is where the branding became much more detailed, and they started introducing like the subgroups. So for the Autobots, the subgroups would be like the Dinobots, the Omnibots, where the Decepticons would have the Insecticons, they would have the Constructicons. So along with these new additions, Hasbro would introduce other features on the reissued toys. And basically, do you remember they put these heat-sensitive rub signs on them that were like these little decals that you could rub with your thumb, and it would reveal whether it was an Autobot or Decepticon? That was basically all they did on the reissue. They didn't change anything else, just for idiot kids like me, who I remember getting the second series of the exact same toy I already owned, but it had this little heat-sensitive decal I could rub, and it would show the sign, which was cool as hell. But, Hasbro marketing execs just taking advantage of dumb little kids. And it worked, though. So, it seemed like a cool little new play feature, but it was, also actually done with a strategic mindset. It was as kind of like a seal of authenticity, like those little heat decals. It would like reveal authentication against. There was a lot of inferior bootlegs that were now coming out and flooding the market. So it was half done to make extra money and half to sort of like cement which were the actual proper toys in the market. So both of these releases took place over 1984 and 1985, but they were considered basically one giant release. So the two series of toys and all the characters make up what's called the first generation of the Transformers for the cartoon series. So everything that came out over this time span was going to be the foundation of this entire Transformers universe. And, the term universe wasn't used yet, but that's the idea with it. So here's a big thing I want to point out that's often overlooked. And I'll cover this more in other shows, but did you ever wonder why there was such an explosion of cartoon shows and toy-based products in the 80s? It's not an anomaly, but up until that point, there'd been a huge restriction on anything that revolved around advertising to children. So this comes out of the 1970s, and tons of studies, up to like 60,000 pages worth of research that showed that young children could not differentiate between an advertisement and a show. And it was seen to be manipulative. It was taking advantage of kids. It was the reason up until the 80s, like a commercial couldn't feature more than 7 seconds of a cartoon portion of it, because kids could, especially little kids, cannot differentiate between what they're seeing. They don't know if it's an ad or a commercial. And it was seen as just, pure manipulation. So one of the first, so a lot of these advocacy groups and everything to do with children's rights and marketing and all that stuff, they've been on top of this. But one of the first things that happens when Ronald Reagan becomes president is he lifts all these restrictions. They call it deregulation, and he appoints a new head of the FCC, and they said that anything regarding the placement of promotional content within children's programming was fair game. they would let the market dictate what was going to be successful, and nothing should be allowed to stand in the way of commerce, basically. So this is what opens the floodgates of cartoon product tie-ins, and it's why you saw so many new toys that just come and cartoons that just come out in the 1980s. You know, Transformers, G.I. Joe, Strawberry Shortcake, Care Bears, like everything. And it's also why so many things like cereal, fast food commercials all start being easily mistaken for cartoons. It's why they start introducing cartoon-based characters. Like every cereal has a cartoon character associated with it because it can just get into the head of a kid, and they start believing it as an actual cartoon as opposed to like product placement and being pushed products. Same thing with fast food. You know, McDonald's brings out all these characters like Birdie and Grimace and the Hamburger or whatever. Just more manipulation on a small, susceptible child's mind. Companies had free reign to promote to this heart's desire, and that's what the Transformers cartoon series was. G.I. Joe would be as well, but the Transformers cartoon series was basically a half-hour commercial. So what they did is that original concept that was put together by Bob Budiansky, Jim Shooter, Dennis O'Neil, was to become a 4-issue comic book series and a 3-part cartoon series. So both of these would be able to introduce the backstory, and more importantly, it would introduce all the characters that little kids like me and you, if you're listening to this and you grew up then, would be soon seeing on the store shelves. So the 3-part pilot miniseries, which I guarantee you've watched, it first aired in September 1984. It was co-produced by Marvel Productions and Sunbow Productions. It was animated by Toei Animation in Japan, and then later on it would be done by ACOM in South Korea. So the toy line, just because of the limitations of what they could put together to make it functional, they had more of a militaristic, obviously robotic look to them. And it was a Japanese designer named Shohei Kohara, who gave them a bit more of a new look for the cartoon. He created a more humanistic appearance. And then another designer named Floro Derry further simplified them to just give it more of a cartoony feel or cartoony look. And that guy would become the lead designer of the whole series. So the story of the first 3-part series is the basic backstory as shared earlier. The Autobots and Decepticons leave Cybertron. They're looking for new resources. They fight on a ship, crash land on Earth. 4 million years is a volcanic eruption. It awakens them. The Decepticons are ready to pillage the Earth. The Autobots befriend the human Sparkplug and Spike Wiki to try to protect the Earth. So the end of the 3-part series concludes with the Decepticons believed to be dead after their space cruiser crashes into the ocean, and the Autobots prepare to head back to Cybertron. Perfect. Easy way to launch all these new toys. So obviously this show's a hit, and besides these 3, they put out more episodes. So the first official season put out 13 that were already commissioned and produced before the miniseries even aired. Like, they weren't messing around. They had this whole thing ready to go, this entire toy launch based on the cartoon. Hasbro is big time planners. They knew they were going to bombard unsuspecting kids like me with all the Transformers we could handle. So the premise of the first season then is, in case you need the refresher, is that the Decepticons, spoiler alert here, survived the crash into the ocean, and they're now building a space bridge to teleport resources back to Cybertron. So the basic arc of the season involves the technology they use, which results in the ultimate doom. I don't know if you remember this. It was the 3-part conclusion where the Decepticons teleport Cybertron into the Earth's orbit. So the show was airing on Saturday mornings between October and December, and it really served as an important function of, not just building up the backstory and introducing the toys, but introducing all the characters that were going to be added to the 1985 toy line. And though, besides, like I talked about those first releases, now this second release, which was considered part of the whole giant release that would come out in 85, that's when you had the Dinobots, things like Skyfire, the Insecticons, Constructicons, the formation of Devastator, all those things were ready to go in 1985. So now we go we're moving into the second season of the cartoon. So everything's heating up. Kids like me freaking the hell out after seeing the show and the toy lines. We want everything we see. And they give it to us in the second season, which has a ridiculous 49 episodes. So they started with 3, had 13 more, and then they did 49. And it seems huge, and it seems like a random number, but it was intentionally done. So the 49 new shows plus the other 16 add up to 65. And if you know about television and syndication, 65 total episodes is the magic number of shows you need to move a series into weekday broadcast syndication. And this was their whole wheelhouse, was to get kids after school, like me and you, and it worked. And this was imperative because they wanted to make Transformers part of a kid's daily routine. And it was the first thing, depending where you live, it was the first thing you did when you got home from school. I think ours ran at 3:30, possibly 4, whether it was G.I. Joe's before that or after, whatever. It was your automatic routine when you got home from school. And that's exactly what Hasbro wanted. So moving into the second season and whatnot, the show changed up the format. And these people are geniuses, like these companies like marketing and how they dictate their toys. So the first season had an arc because they're trying to they're building up the storyline and the characters in the universe. They're trying to connect, the whole thing. In the next season, though, with all those 49, they focused on each episode as a standalone episode. They tried not to connect things with all those new episodes because that way the broadcasters could air them in any order and not create confusion among the storyline. Like if you watch in that 3-part miniseries of the first 13, if you jump in on episode 5 and then go to 2 and then you're going to be all over the place. Like that's what a story arc is. It carries the arc of the season. So another genius move. They just had all these individual shows. It was like a sitcom at that point, a situation based show that revolved around those 22 minutes. So then they didn't have to worry about what kids were seeing as long as they were seeing it. So this is when things promotion-wise step into high gear. So whereas, the miniseries in the first series introduced the story and the main characters, the second series was basically making each episode was a commercial for an individual character. And G.I. Joe did this as well too. So say in that second season of 49 episodes, like episode 21 would be just a spotlight on an individual character or a group of characters that would connect to a specific release coming up. And this is why when you watch cartoon shows, specifically during the 80s, you notice, we wouldn't have noticed when we were kids, but you notice that all the characters would always address each other by their full name. And this was important because they wanted to identify the character and the subsequent toy that would come out. And it's also the same reason, and they do this more in like G.I. Joe. They would refer to any vehicle by its full name. So like say in the show, say in G.I. Joe, they'd be like, one example I was just looking at, like instead of one of the characters saying like, "Hey, Snake Eyes, hop in the Jeep," he would say, "Hey, Snake Eyes, hop in the Desert Fox." Kids needed to know the name of the toy that they're going to be screaming for in the middle of a Walmart or whatever. And then, so say just in the fact of G.I. Joe, they put out 250 vehicles over the course of that series, which is nuts. So heartless bastards knowing we couldn't get all of them. But this is the same thing in Transformers. Each of these episodes would reveal a new character. They would make sure to always identify that character by name or any of the accessories that would come with it, whatever. So it's obviously dollars and cents are the bottom line at the end of the day. Yeah, I get it. But it wasn't all just commerce, as the series creators really had some creativity behind things. These are artistic people, and they really made it a point to expand on the series. Give it some more history, expand the lore. They would do they introduced the first female Transformer and a girl named Carly who was Spike's girlfriend. But toys sales are still the name of the game, and they would also introduce the remainder of the 85 toy line with a 2-part episode called Dinobot Island, which I remember very, very well. And to me, some of the best toys ever created, the Dinobots. So this was shown midway through the season, and most of these new characters were new Autobot cars and mini vehicles taken from that Diaclone and Microchange line of Takara toys. So it was like another push to get those things out there that they hadn't released yet. They also introduced, if you remember the Decepticon triple changers. They had Astro Train, they had Blitzwing, which was amazing, and one of the most expensive toys ever put out by them, Omega Supreme. Okay, so all this brings us into Transformers the movie, and this is the 1986 movie that would bridge the gap between the second and third season, and they would do this to be able to put out Transformers. And it came out on August 8th, 1986. It takes place in the year 2005, 20 years after the events of season 2. So if you remember this movie was a bit of a train wreck for a lot of reasons. The first off is I was not allowed to see it in theaters. How old was I then? 6, 7, 8, 8, 9? Okay, either way, I wasn't allowed. So it does a few things. It leads to the death of some certain characters, basically in order to clear away all the discontinued products from 1984 and 1985 and introduce a new cast of characters for the 1986 toy release. And then it traumatized the living crap out of a lot of us. So I don't know if you've seen this lately or can remember it. There's a lot that goes on in this movie. It was pretty violent for a quote-unquote kids movie. There's death. It had some cursing. And the problem is it led to the death of Optimus Prime. And not only is this bad enough, they kill him off like 22 minutes into the movie. So the makers of this movie had no idea, I think, the impact they were going to have on a generation of kids, just because they were trying to get some new toys out for Christmas. So the basic premise, just if you need a refresher on this, it's not a bad movie, really. I think it's actually pretty good. But so the Decepticons have conquered Cybertron, while the Autobots hold up on nearby moons. Optimus Prime sends a shuttle to Earth for supplies, but it's hijacked by Megatron. Leads to the death, we'll call this the clearing out of characters like Ironhide, Ratchet, Prowl, Brawn. The Decepticons, they travel to Earth, they attack Autobot City, they kill even more. Optimus Prime returns with the Dinobots, and he and Megatron have it out, leading to the death of Optimus Prime. Then Starscream disposes of the wounded Megatron in space, while the planet-sized Unicron, voiced by Orson Welles in his very last role, is starting to go around. He can eat planets, but he offers Megatron a new body if he destroys the Matrix, which has the ability to destroy Unicron. So Megatron is now converted or repackaged, if you want to look at it the correct way, into Galvatron. Then he ends up killing Starscream. The end of all this is that the Autobots attack Unicron, Hot Rod attacks Galvatron, and then obtains the Matrix, which rebrands him as Rodimus Prime, the way that Optimus said would happen in their darkest hour. Then the power of the Matrix destroys Unicron. Okay, pretty intense. But I bought this movie on Blu-ray. It's legit good. The animation is amazing. It's got a very anime feel to it. The soundtrack really dates the hell out of this thing, but there's some really cool vintage 80s rock. But when I saw it later on as a kid, again, I had no idea I was watching a 90-minute commercial. But again, it's pretty monumental. I mean, besides the trauma and killing off of beloved characters and launching a new toy line, it's very creative, and there's a lot of big name actors in it. I don't know if you remember, Casey Kasem from American Top 40, Robert Stack, who's from Unsolved Mysteries, Judd Nelson, obviously Peter Cullen, John Machida Jr., who did the Micro Machines commercials as the voice of Blur. Leonard Nimoy's in it, obviously Frank Welker does Megatron. And then in their last roles, not only Orson Welles, but Scatman Crothers. That's amazing. I had no idea about this. Apparently Orson Welles had no idea what he was making at all, but it's still cool he's in it. But I didn't realize it was Scatman Crothers' last role, which is also awesome. Okay, so we'll look more at the future of Transformers here past this. And to follow the full path of this could take days, and you've probably got better things to do. Or not, but we can finish this up here together. So in the coming years, they would release season 3, which picks up where the movie left off. The Autobots are now in control of Cybertron, and Galvatron still leads the Decepticons. Also features the return of Starscream, or the reintroduction, whatever you want to call it. The series 3 gets a little more creative. It's got some more interconnecting storylines and arcs that connect a lot of the shows this time, but kids are pissed still about the death of Optimus Prime, results in a massive letter writing campaign that forced Hasbro to resurrect him in a 2-part episode called The Return of Optimus Prime, which came out in March 1987. They probably could have rebranded him as Optimus Prime Classic. So that's if you don't know the history of Coke and New Coke, that's that whole thing. That'll be another show altogether. But there would be a season 4 that debuted in November 1987, and this would basically bring the whole series to a close. But Transformers wouldn't disappear completely, as they had a 5th season, which I use in quotes, which was released that was just basically reruns of 15 episodes from the original series, and then they took the movie and edited it into 4 different episodes. And I think at this point I was not as into it or stopped watching, but that's basically the trajectory it took. So during this whole time and up to now, the toys have always been going on pretty strong. Not long after the movie, a few new lines were brought out, such as, I don't know if you remember, like Headmasters, Target Masters. There was also the Pretenders and the Power Masters. They featured, new versions of Optimus Prime and all that. In 87, they would release the Micromasters, which were tiny versions of Transformers meant to compete against the hugely popular Micro Machines at the time. Then by the 90s, the Transformers were selling very poorly. There was not a lot of interest in the US, but they were doing well here in Canada and the UK and in Japan. So they would keep going on and would release Generation 2. So there's the debate that there's no such thing as Generation 1, which is all that stuff I mentioned before. That's simply referred to as Transformers, but they released Generation 2 in 1983. That old Takara toy company would actually take over the production, but pretty much just use those old molds from 84 and 85 with some new color schemes and finishes. They did change Megatron from a handgun to a tank due to safety and security concerns, so that's something. I think there's a story of someone in an airport getting busted because they had Megatron in their suitcase, and when they went through the x-ray scanner, everyone went nuts, but, that happens. So here's some of the other toy series that came out in various forms. So you had Beast Wars, which is pretty successful, in Beast Machines from 96 to 2001. Then a line called Robots in Disguise, 2001-2002. Transformers Armada, 2002 to 2003. Transformers Universe, which is 2002 and still going on now. There's Transformers Energon, which went from 03 to 05. Transformers Cybertron from 05 to 07. This is actually a real thing. Transformers Kiss Players. Look this up. This is an actual thing. And then the Transformers Classics. So we'll start winding down, and we got to deal with Michael Bay taking over all of this. Transformers always felt like one of those untouchable franchises that would never, ever be able to cross over into like a feature film. It's just the technology might not have been there. It was too monumental, but Michael Bay proved that all wrong in 2007, releasing the live-action Transformers movie. So I think everyone was psyched for this. And it was, like, looking back, it's okay. I don't think it really embraced the history and the mythos of the franchise. Made them maybe a little bit too human, but looking back now, it's a friggin' masterpiece compared to the other crap he's put out. I apologize if you like these movies, but I don't know. They're brutal. They're just such a huge blown opportunity, but they've been so successful around the world. There's no reason that they didn't make 5 of them or however many. I don't even think I saw the last 2 or last one. You can look at various problems, like the robot design is foreign to how they look. They've changed this with the Bumblebee movie, which I think was a good move, but from the Michael Bay aspect, they were trying to create a realistic interpretation of them. I don't know if that connected as much. And the first movie, even the others, they had a bit more of an alien invasion feel to it, and it just didn't seem to capture the essence of the Transformers. Revenge of the Fallen, I actually thought was better than the first, but again, they just get progressively worse. But okay, don't take my word on it. If you haven't seen these, just read the Rotten Tomatoes reviews or every movie review ever. So To me, the progression of these movies went from disappointment. I think that's the best way to sum it up to start with. They went from disappointment to completely unwatchable. But, that's my perspective. So we'll wrap it up here. Through all the ups and downs, Michael Bay being probably the down, Transformers remains one of the biggest parts of the 80s and a huge part of everyone's childhood, I'd say. To me, there's no other toy that stirred up such excitement in me. I watched the cartoon shows religiously. Like I said, G.I. Joe's a close second. Maybe He-Man rounds up my top 3, but nothing really captured my mind like Transformers. To me, it was the kind of toy a kid didn't even know he wanted. It incorporates all elements of things you love, like technology, machines, cars, planes, battles, action, and a very cool backstory, which I think makes them one of the definitive parts of the entire 1980s. Okay, let's wrap it up there. Thank you for listening. I appreciate you taking the time to check out this show. Like I said, if you want to see more about the history of Transformers, you can head over to everything80spodcast.com/2. All the show notes, the whole article, all the pictures, a lot of cool stuff. And if you haven't already, again, make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I should be there. That's it for me. Thank you for listening. I'll see you soon.